Welcome and bienvenue. My name is Barrington Walker, and I'm the Associate Vice President, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Professor of History at Wilfrid Laurier University. On behalf of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, I am delighted to welcome you to the third Big Thinking event at this 91st Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences. Today, Dr. Denise da Silva will give a presentation titled, Shift in Thinking, It All Begins with Decolonization. Today's event will take place in English and American Sign Language, or ASL. We have also included French simultaneous interpretation, as well as closed captioning in English and French. An ASL interpreter should appear on your Zoom screen. For simultaneous interpretation, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says Interpretation. To turn on English closed captioning, please navigate to the bottom of your screen and click on the Closed Captioning button. You may also find it under Settings. For French closed captioning, please click on the link provided in the Zoom chat box. This information will appear again in the chat during the event for those joining us later. Now, to begin, I'm speaking to you from my office on the campus of Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, on lands that are part of the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty. As we gather virtually, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. On behalf of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, I would like to thank the sponsors for the Big Thinking at Congress 2022 series, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Universities Canada, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation. The Big Thinking series at Congress brings together leading scholars and public figures to address some of the most pressing concerns of our time. It is our great honor to welcome Dr. da Silva, an academic and practicing artist, as today's speaker. She is a professor and former director of the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Following the presentation, I will rejoin you for a moderated discussion with Dr. da Silva. We will be able to take a few audience questions, and you can submit yours by typing them into the question and answer box. You can also participate in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #BigThinking and #Congress. That's CONGRESSH. So thank you for joining us today. And it is now my pleasure to present Dr. Ted Hewitt, President of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Ted will introduce us to Dr. da Silva, who will then share what promises to be a fascinating conversation. Over to you, Ted.
Thank you, Barrington, for your kind introduction and your warm welcome. The Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council is proud to partner once again with the Canadian Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences for this important annual Congress, which continues to be the largest academic gathering in Canada and a critical opportunity for us to connect as social sciences and humanities community and with communities across society. I am particularly honored to introduce our guest speaker of today's Big Thinking lecture, Dr. Denise Ferreira da Silva, in the context of SSHRC's commitment to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in our programs, policies, and in our own organization. La promotion de l'équité, de la diversité et de l'inclusion dans la recherche est un pilier essentiel de l'objectif stratégique du serrage visant à renforcer le leadership mondial du Canada dans la recherche en sciences humaines. Dans son plan stratégique Momentum 2020-2025, Le CRSH s'est engagé, entre autres, à favoriser un accès équitable aux occasions de financement pour tous les chercheurs, à intégrer l'équité, la diversité et l'inclusion dans la conception des programmes et les pratiques de recherche, ainsi qu'à recueillir et à analyser les données liées à l'équité, de la diversité et de l'inclusion afin d'en tenir compte dans le processus décisionnel. Nous sommes, en outre, guidés par le plan d'action des 3 organismes pour l'équité, la diversité et l'inclusion, qui comprend des mesures pour mieux comprendre l'impact de racisme et d'autres formes de discrimination sur nos programmes et nos activités, tant à l'interne qu'à l'externe. This past year, we launched a dedicated funding opportunity, $12 million, the Race, Gender, and Diversity Initiative, for new community-led research projects exploring systemic barriers facing diverse groups. The newly launched projects will generate fresh perspectives and insights based on the lived experiences of underrepresented and disadvantaged groups. And just a few weeks ago, Federal Budget 2022 proposed $40.9 million over 5 years starting next year, and $9.7 million ongoing through SSHRC and the other research agencies to support targeted scholarships and fellowships for promising Black student researchers. Our work on EDI is complemented by actions to support our commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and the TRC's calls to action. The tri-agency strategy released in January 2020 entitled Setting New Directions to Support Indigenous Research and Research Training in Canada is guiding the ways forward in building new models to support Indigenous research and training that support the research priorities of Indigenous peoples and champion Indigenous leadership, self-determination, and capacity in research. Pour nous guider en tant qu'organisme, nous avons créé plusieurs comités consultatifs, comme le Cercle consultatif en matière de recherche autochtone et plus récemment, le Comité consultatif de lutte contre le racisme à l'endroit des personnes noires de CRSH. Composé de chercheurs noirs provenant de petits et de grands établissements, ce comité conseille le CRSH sur les moyens de circonscrire les entraves existantes, d'assurer un accès équitable aux personnes noires et de leur permettre de faire entendre leur voix et d'accroître leur visibilité au sein des programmes de recherche et de formation en recherche du CRSH. Le comité organise une discussion de groupe au congrès demain afin d'explorer les défis des chercheurs noirs lorsqu'ils tentent d'obtenir du financement et la façon de mieux inclure et promouvoir le travail des chercheurs noirs. Je vous invite à vous joindre à Karine Cohen-Sanchez, Wendell Adjeti, Barbara McNeil et Barbara Ann Hamilton-Hinch à 14 heures demain pour l'événement Mettre les voix des personnes noires au centre de la recherche. I'm extremely proud that one of the committee members is our guest lecturer today. Denise Ferreira da Silva is a professor and director at the Social Justice Institute and senior faculty fellow at St. John's College and the University of British Columbia. She is an adjunct professor with the Department of Fine Art at Monash University as well. Dr. Ferreira da Silva is an academic as well as a practicing artist whose work addresses the ethno-political challenges of the global present. She has exhibited and lectured at major art venues, including the Pompidou Center in Paris, Whitechapel Gallery in London, and the Guggenheim and Museum of Modern Art in New York. Dr. Ferreira da Silva is a prolific author and has published, among other books, Toward a Global Idea of Race and A Dívida Impagável, and has a forthcoming book called Unpayable Debt. She is a member of several boards, including Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, the International Consortium for Critical Theory Programs, and the journals Postmodern Culture, Social Identities, and Dark Matter. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Denise Ferreira da Silva. Madame.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barrington Walker, for the introduction to the program, and Dr. Ted Hewitt for this kind introduction. And I would like to congratulate SHRC for all these initiatives. And I would like to thank the Federation for the invitation to be part of this important program series of talks, and also, of course, Lisa, Matthew, Rachel, the American ESL and French translators, and everyone involved in making this event possible, to make this electronic thing work. I speak from the ancestral unceded lands of the Musqueam First Nation. I always like to say that I am deeply grateful for their hospitality, as throughout these 7 years that I have lived on the lands, as we live constantly, consistently under ongoing colonial and racial violence. It's interesting to be part of this program called Big Thinking, because thinking is kind of my object of study. So what I have prepared to share with you today is about thinking. But let me open my PowerPoint here. Thinking involves abstractions, ideas, principles, concepts, theories, categories that refer to things and events and are used in answers for questions about what they are and how they exist or happen. Famous abstractions are, for instance, Newton's law of gravity and Einstein's principle of general relativity, both of which answer the question of why bodies, things with mass, move the way they do, both of which assume that gravity is an effect of the presence of bodies in the vicinity of one another in space. Now, an important difference between them is that Newton's gravity describes a one-on-one relationship in which a more massive body has a direct effect on what happens to a less massive one, while Einstein's general relativity describes gravity as the body's effect on space-time, that is, on the context constituted and shared with other bodies. Though they are radically different, both abstractions share two important components. They explain how A, things that exist separate from one another as bodies, B, affect one another, or in Newton's representation, or the context they shared in Einstein's presentation of gravitativity. So though it is possible to pinpoint the moment in history when these two abstractions emerged, and by those abstractions, I mean separability and efficacy, both components are now integral part of our thinking. They are the basic abstractions that constitute what I like to call the infrastructures of our thinking about everything, including global and historical conditions and processes. So key to my presentation today is the argument that separability and efficacy are also the main impediments to the realization that decolonization, that is, the restoration of the total value expropriated from native lands and slave labor, decolonization is the only possible signifier signified for anything that can be taken as a descriptor for what so many mean by under the name of justice, be it global justice, social justice. Toward shifting how we think about decolonization, I propose another abstraction, one which is being inspired by findings in classical and quantum physics. An abstraction that, instead of describing separate things in space or in space-time, separate things that affect one another, this abstraction gives an image of infinitely materially implicated things, for which I use the phrase deep implicancy. And I have to notice that also that this particular descriptor also resonates with indigenous philosophies found across the planet, as well as praxis and knowledge that prevailed in Europe once upon a time. Because it is counterintuitive, because it departs from the prevailing inner image of how things exist, an image that is given by separability and efficacy, deep implicancy can be best presented through an appeal to the imagination, that is, as an invitation to contemplate and speculate on a what-if question. And this is what I have to share with you today. An invite to speculate on an account of global warming that foregrounds extraction and the juridic, the colonial, and symbolic racial mechanisms of power that support it. And I'll do so through comments on global warming and an artwork by Maria Teresa Alves, and by showing one piece that I created. So my proposition is simple. Decolonization should become the starting point of any consideration of global warming. So instead of considering what's captured by terms such as the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, with descriptions that presume separability and efficacy, I invite you to hold deep implicancy as the proper descriptor for existence. So, but this starting point is basically the same as that of the theories of the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. So yes, human activities, which are all ultimately dependent on the extraction of oil and other minerals from the planet, these activities are leading to a temperature rise that will cause the destruction or extinction of humans and other living things on this planet. Now, but while I agree with this point of departure, what I would like to do is to shift the focus from human or capital as the efficient causes to extraction as an economic practice and coloniality as the as the juridical form that facilitates extraction. And in doing so, I take what I call a raw materialist approach and foreground the simple fact that global warming is also about excess of heat, that is, of the transfer of kinetic energy generated by collisions of the constituents of a given material existent. Even if without a good grasp of what is at work in global warming, we know that it has to do with the emission and accumulation of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which has raised the temperature of the lower layer of the Earth, of the troposphere. The rise in temperature results from these gases' absorption and emission of infrared radiation. Now, the increased accumulation of the gases above the Earth has to do basically with an increased extraction of matter from Earth, and that extraction of matter in the form of fossil fuels, soil nutrients, which are used to feed crops and livestock. So it is basically about heat, as I said, about energy transfer. As we know, heat flows from flash to flash by contact, radiation, or mediation. Every existence emits electromagnetic radiation as long as its temperature is greater than absolute zero. And as we know, absolute zero is a temperature that has only been observed in the lab because it's created by scientists. Anyway, heat, that is internal kinetic energy, as we know, like any other form of energy, can be transferred, transformed, or transduced into another form of energy. So focusing on extraction then gives an immediate image of how much global capital, including the fixed capital, not the machines that run the financial world, how much global capital is dependent on labor and lands expropriated from the racial others of Europe. So my point is that the accumulation of gases is inseparable from the expropriation of land and labor necessary for access to fossil fuels and soil. Whether we locate its efficient cause earlier in the emergence of agriculture, as highlighted by the writers of the Anthropocene, or later, or in the later 18th century, with the Industrial Revolution, as preferred by the writers of the Capitalocene, there is no question that a certain concentration of means of production and of access to raw materials responds for the excess of greenhouses. And I don't think I need to say much to support the point that coloniality, which is a mode of governance that relies on the deployment of total violence to ensure the expropriation of internal energy of lands and bodies, coloniality has facilitated this concentration of for centuries now. That being the case, then it is not unreasonable to point to the fact that the accumulation of these gases also expresses materially the extent to which, the extent and intensity of the degree of concentration of expropriated internal kinetic energy that is being facilitated by coloniality and other juridic economic mechanisms of state capital. So I'm going to elaborate on this point with reflections inspired by Maria Teresa Alves' work, in particular by her poignant The Return of a Lake. An installation commissioned by Documenta, which is a German art event that happens every 5 years. Return of a Lake is about the destruction of a lake in the region of Chalco near Mexico City. And that happened in 1908. And it was done to allow a Spaniard immigrant to claim the land underneath the lake as his possession. This human-made ecological catastrophe destroyed the livelihood of 24 indigenous villages in the area and continued to have an adverse effect, such as the structure of infrastructure and also, most recently, as Maria Teresa Alves tells us, earthquakes. The artwork, which resulted from a collaboration between this Brazilian artist and the Community Museum of Chico Valley, also includes an artist's book and the recreation of something called Achinampa, which is, and I'm quoting, an indigenous engineered artificial island for highly productive hydro-agriculture. Before the Spanish invasion in the 16th century, 20 million tons of maize were produced annually in this Chinampa region, which fed a population of 170,000 people, end quote. Now, if the lake was drained over a century ago, so why the urgency, you may be wondering? Well, Maria Teresa Alves tells us that the lake, and I'm quoting again, the lake now known as Lake Chuhuapa Chico, and this is the name of the two communities that make up the area. Well, the lake is returning, and it's returning because fluvial waters are being captured by a depression that has formed as a result of the land subsidence and the ensuing lowering of the lake bed due to the excessive pumping out of the underground water that is sent to Mexico City, end quote. When considering this work and its commitment not to let what has happened disappear in the flow of linear time, the work itself as a return of the lake, I immediately recalled how the abstract linearity that's time is so crucial for the prevalence of separability and efficacy in our descriptions of existence. As Alves' work shows, the colonial act, the theft, is ongoing. The work images colonialism as a timeless theft, and in doing so, it also reminds us of how linear time, which gives sequentiality, that is the idea that one thing follows the other, and that which has passed is never to return, how sequentiality makes it impossible to contend with European conquest and settlement in the Americas and other continents. I mean, with colonialism and the repetitions and reverberations of this never-ending act. Speculating, reflecting on Alves' work, it is possible to think that, yes, the order of the lake has been extracted, but we can also think that the Chicos community's claim to that water is not so much a claim, it's not a claim to possession, which is ultimately only about economic value and juridical rights. Theirs is an ancestral claim, which is something that is established in indigenous philosophies of the Americas, the Africa and the Pacific, but also indicated when we consider change materially. When we consider change not as the effect of the passage of something abstract, time, but in terms of the alterations of temperature and pressure, that is, in terms of phase transition, the same matter changing into solid, liquid, gas, plasma, or in terms of transduction, the shifting from one form of energy into another, like the microphone transforming electrical waves into sound waves, as it's happening just now as I speak to you. The Chico community has a claim to the lake that no longer exists because their ancestors' bodies were composed by what grew because of these waters. So when the water was extracted, parts of them were taken elsewhere. That is the claim, and that cannot be measured because it is, everything, it is uncountable. What has been extracted remains transduced into abstraction too, such as money, and now into these virtual financial objects that prevail in global capital. That is, this becomes clear when we attend to two dimensions at the same time. First, extraction and the total violence that enables it, the ongoing theft, that is economic dispossession. And second, to what I call redecomposition, that is the fact that the water remains physically as their bodies, the trees, and other things that still exist in Chico because the lake had been there before. So what I'm saying is that we can think that the wealth that has been accumulated by the descendant of the occupiers, of the settlers in these lands, the wealth that was sent back to Europe in the form of objects, but also of raw materials that entered in the initial accumulation of capital as industrial capital. Stolen wealth that has been transformed in so many ways is also composed of that water, of that lake. So if we take these two dimensions into account, then we can think of the return of the lake along different lines. It is not the return of a possession. It is the return of a constitutive part of the community, like the return of a limb, and that can't be monetized. It is also because the wealth yielded by what was extracted enters in the composition of what exists, not only in Europe, but everywhere. The return is also a homecoming of sorts. It is an actualization of a deep implicancy that already exists. So it cannot be monetized, it cannot be calculated and resolved as a loss or a kind of gain. So what I'm trying to get at is that thinking without separability and efficacy and ways of creating meaning, these ontopsemological components of our thinking pose and allow, that kind of thinking without them can give us another appreciation of Indigenous peoples' claims for decolonization and Black folks' demands for reparations and abolition. What has been the return of something that has never completely disappeared, but which has also made them as part of all that exists right here, right now. So to conclude, coming to a conclusion, deep implicancy comports descriptions of the present global conditions without the social, scientific, and historical tools, such as those used in the thinking of the Anthropocene, which only reinscribe the human man's exceptionality as the supreme, efficient, and formal cause at work in the world. It describes everything that exists and constitutes existence as deeply implicated because each is a singular video composition that expresses everything else in a unique way with elemental correspondence that describes the mode of appearance of such compositions. That is doesn't describe things and those elements as discrete entities, but in a manner similar to the phases of matter, that is liquid, gaseous, solid, plasma. For instance, in the same way that we can easily think of the carbon dioxide emitted by our car engines and synthesized by plants as gaseous forms of the planktons that constitute petroleum, we can think of nitrous oxide emitted by the sugar plantations of the colonial period and the soya plantations in today's Brazil as the gaseous form of the internal energy of the soil and bodies of the yesterday's slaves and today's day laborers. Heat is useful here, of course, because it is the name, because it names transfer of internal energy, potential and kinetic, and a search of mass, that is matter, without suggesting that something becomes something else or loses some of its attributes in the process. Heat merely names a process through which we can trace the transformation of what has been extracted from mineral or oil into gasoline, into money, into cars, into vacations, and so on. Whatever shape it takes, has taken, will take, solid, liquid, gas, plasma. What has been extracted through colonial force, the potential energy of the indigenous peoples of these American lands and African slaves that worked on them, that remain in as global capital and the means of production and raw materials it uses for self-reproduction, that is for accumulation. When considering climate change, then instead of immediately betting on energy sources that require new mobilizations of the colonial apparatus, such as the lithium used in electric car batteries, we need to remember that just as urgent as the need to stop and try to correct the effects of global warming, just as urgent is decolonization or the restoration of the total value, the return of what was expropriated from native lands and slave bodies. And I'm just closing with this piece of artwork, which is one that I use to illustrate the kind of thinking I am proposing. So we have the image of a banana, and this image of the banana as it allows us to connect the cosmic event that gave origin to potassium-40, which were the supernovas that happened billions of years ago, the fact that the banana is measured for radiation contamination, precisely because of this potassium 40. And the fact, this potassium, that the banana is crucial for the work of the human heart. So we need to eat bananas precisely because it keeps our heart functioning. And what brings me to this consideration is also the fact that even though the banana is originally in Southeast Asia, Portuguese conquerors start the spreading of this fruit all over the world, and now we find it in different parts, in different continents, and believe that they are native from those continents, even though they aren't. So looking at the banana, we can connect these quantic, cosmic, organic, and historic dimensions in one fruit. And the proposition here is that we look at everything that we see that exists around us and see all those dimensions at the same time and start thinking with them. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Da Silva, for an engaging and fascinating talk. And I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of questions from members of our audience. And I'm going to just remind them to please put, audience members, that is, to put your questions in the question and answer box. So while we wait on questions from the audience, Dr. Da Silva, I was hoping that you could say a little bit more, or say a little something about how you see the big ideas that inform your talk and all of those connections that you made at the very end about the various registers of thinking about all the things that you talked about, how you see this, how you see these big ideas informing the social sciences and the humanities, or potentially transforming the way that people on this call think about their various academic disciplines in the social sciences and humanities.
Thank you, Barrington, for this question, because I think maybe I shouldn't say how I think it, but it is in fact a call for that we transform the ways in which we do our work, and this call comes from my experience as a social scientist. I was trained as a social scientist in a social science program, which means that I was trained as a political scientist, a sociologist, and an anthropologist. And from very early on, as I was, as during my training, my academic training, I was also an activist in the Black Brazilian movement back, doing my undergrad and master's. So I was as an activist and a student, I was very much aware of the ways in which the knowledge that what I was learning in college, how it was very much important and influenced those social movements and our demands, and the ways in which we described the political circumstances, the ways in which we identified what were our goals, the ways in which we define in that moment racial justice, for instance, thinking about Brazil. And over those, which weren't many years, but were important years, in particular, because in Brazil back then, we were transitioning from a military dictatorship back to the democratic organization of things. I could also see how much all the concessions and the transformations that had to be made by the movement, precisely because of the radicality of the demand, right? In particular, looking at the demands from the Black movement and the demands from the indigenous peoples in Brazil. So there is a radicality in that becomes crucial when, especially when you're talking about, settler countries like Canada and Brazil, in which we know that the demands made by indigenous and Black populations, they are demands that challenge the very existence of these settler countries. And if you think from the point of view of like sociology and political science, for instance, that nation state that is challenged by those demands is precisely what gives meaning to our craft, to our scholarship. So that inspired me, or maybe I would say I say inspired now because that was a long time ago, but back then was more like a deep preoccupation, deep political preoccupation. But inspired me to ask the question about what if we started thinking differently about the world itself, but then also about our global social conditions. What if we had different bases for even making sense of what for what falls under the historical? Would it lead us to descriptions of our social global existence that would be more adequate in terms of their capacity to support the demands from indigenous peoples and Black populations and other racially subordinated populations? So that's the beginning. So what if, what do we do? And yes, and that's been many years now.
That was a wonderful answer. Dr. Da Silva, thank you so much. We do have a few questions that have come in from the audience, and I'll start with the first one. What inspirations or learnings should we be amplifying from artists or activists as we try to shift our thinking?
Thank you for this question. I think, okay, so what inspiration and learning? From artists, I think it is, and that's something that I have been experiencing and experimenting with. It is, and I'm speaking as a social scientist, right? So let me just say, speaking as a social scientist, I think it is, we should remember the pleasure of experimentation. So instead of being limited and constrained by, let's say, peer review, which just tells you, right, over and over again how to stay in the limits, how not to dare, especially when you talk about racialized scholars, right? Because we are even more under scrutiny to just fit. I think we should allow ourselves, in addition to doing the work that we have to do under all those constraints, also to experiment, to ask what if questions and to follow them through as we are doing the work. Of course, and talking about racialized scholars and indigenous scholars, that means that we have to work twice as much. Well, we do work twice as much. It means we have to work 10 times as much. But then at the same time, I think it will allow us creating and also demanding, organizing as academics and demanding space for experimentation would also really allow us to expand the range of possibilities for both, right, for designing critiques of our social conditions, but also for imagining ways of living that are not only merely reproductive. So I think what I'm trying to say is that taking inspiration from artists in terms of experimentation would allow us to do both, to remain and do the critical work that is so necessary, but also in doing so, also bring out the creative, which is, I think we need more of that. And then I think from activists, it is the same, right? Maybe it's not so much about experimentation, but it is about keeping the urgency. So instead of being dominated by the deadlines that we never meet anyway, we are always late, also attend to the political urgency and try to respond to it, or not to respond in terms of providing a solution, but to respond in terms of getting our work to, accelerate and daring to find other ways of doing the work, and that's not only about writing or presenting, also even more importantly, the work we do in the classroom, right? Because it's where it matters. Is the training that we do in the classroom.
Thank you for that very thoughtful answer. I have another one from the audience, and that is, what is needed to go from changing how we think to changing how we act and implementing decolonization practices?
So I'm not pretending that I'm giving I'm answering the questions as questions. I'm not pretending that I'm providing the answers, like the big answers. But I'm going to answer the questions because that's a position I'm occupying right here. So from my point of view, from the limited position from which I can do anything that may matter or not, I think, and it's very simple. I think that number one, the arrogance has to go, and we have to realize that changing how we think is not, and changing how we think in ways that renders us closer to what's being judged and described as minor thinking or not proper thinking in our modern European traditions, because we are basically still very much modern European thinkers. Changing how we think or raising questions both about the limits of our thinking and about the ways in which the tools for our thinking are also very much the tools for domination and violence. I think acknowledging that is important. Let me say this again, acknowledging, number one, that our way of thinking is just one way of thinking. Number two, that this way of thinking, this one we practice here as social scientists and folks in the humanities and artists, is very much tied to these last 400 years, 500 years of colonial violence. And number three, that changing our way of thinking is it is crucial, also as part of a practice in support of decolonization, by which I mean it's not enough to call what we do decolonial or anti-colonial. It is also important that in doing the work we do, we understand both the extent to which this academic intellectual work can support and be part of a range of decolonial praxis, but I'd rather say of a range of praxis that will respond to the urgency of decolonization, and then and then at the same time, I'll just leave it there. I'm not going to say anymore.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. This leads us, I think, nicely to another question posed by the audience, and it is this idea that we are all connected. How can it be explained as a function of colonization, but also as a function of decolonization?
Very nice question. I mean, all the questions are really great, but this one is a very nice one because it really requires that I make some distinctions, which is something that that I was hoping. So maybe I don't want to see, there is one term that we use in order to make the distinctions and then give the meaning very immediately. We say scales, right? We just think but I don't like scales because I really think that is all happening in the same level. So I'll make distinctions that you may think of them in terms of different scales, but I'm just talking about things that are happening at the same time. So the idea that we are all connected, it is a bit beyond that we are all connected. So if you think of my banana image there, it is not so much the idea that we are all connected, but it is the idea that we are all made out of the same stuff. We are made out of the same elementary particles. The potassium 40 that we find in the banana is the same, materially, the same element that was created in those supernova, I know, billions of years ago. So this is number one. Now, we're made of the same stuff. Now, that same stuff is not only, okay, so we are made of the same stuff, and we are, and everything that exists is one possible singular composition of the same stuff that's being recycled, for billions of years. Not all of them billions of years, because they emerged in different moments in the cosmic trajectory, but that. So number one, so it's the same stuff. It's not only being connected, but at the same time, those singular compositions and the elements that constitute each of those singular compositions, they are entangled, right? The description, the concept in physics is entanglement. They are entangled, but that is not a relation or a connection, because a connection implies things that are separate in space or in time, right? And they affect each other, like can give us, something that is given by a correlation, for instance, as a way, for the quantitative sociologists there, two variables that, respond to each other. So that's a Newtonian image. The image given by quantum physics is that those things particles that are part of different singular compositions, they are linked immediately, right? If you measure one, if you measure the position of the one that is in Brazil, you find the momentum of the other, which is on Pluto, right? Immediately. So there is something about the ways in which they exist that it's beyond the connection that you see exteriorly. It is constitutive. What this is, then this is a different story. Okay, so that's I'll call it the metaphysical ontological moment in there, or the scale. This on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the historical. So taking that banana again, that banana allows, for instance, allows for a description of the past, let's say, 500 years, that takes us from the Portuguese, exploring, traveling on the Indian Ocean, that in 1490, for instance, all the way to the US in the 1950s, the ways in which the US became more and more involved in the political circumstances in Central America and the Caribbean through, the control of Chiquita and, well, those transnational companies, fruit companies that are still very much have a monopoly. And then, no, I'm thinking here of Chiquita banana. So you can look at the banana, for instance, not only in terms of the potassium 40 that connects that banana in the picture to the supernova and to, you know, the potassium in my heart right now, because those two are created at the same time. And then at the same time, you can look at that banana and through this connection, which we call historical. And that will take you again back to the potassium 40 and to the functioning of your heart. You see, it is not so much from the assumption, on the one hand, from this assumption, this description of existence that assumes that everything is made out of the same stuff, which is a given, you can also begin to read things, singular compositions, such as that banana, as a descriptor of historical processes that not only will connect different places, but also connect each particular place to the whole history, quote unquote, history of the cosmos, to the functioning of a particular body. Now, in the case of this particular piece, which has been also, you know, has different names, what I'm using that connection as a point of departure for making the case for decolonization. Why? Because thinking in this way, and I call it fractal thinking, thinking fractally, you can also recognize that for instance, the copper, which is in the chips in my computer, that what's allowing us to have this conversation is very much, we can trace the conditions of possibility for this copper, both to some cosmic event of a long time ago, but also to King Leopold's taking possession of what was to become the Congo DRC, and the extraction and the violence that is being plaguing the Congo DRC since then, and that continues now, and the same violence that it's not made, that doesn't prevent that the copper be extracted to be used in my computer, right? So that is, I think the point here is that what I'm trying to call attention here is that the conditions for our existence, they are still very much made possible by colonial violence, and that renders us very much very active in ways that we usually don't think about, but very, very active participants and connected to that. And that makes decolonization an ethical demand for us because of how much implicated we are, and not in the same, and we are implicated both as the potassium 40, talking about the banana now, but we are also implicated, as the caravels, in that historical image. Anyway.
Thank you so much for such a thoughtful, nuanced, and insightful answer to that question. And that is all the time we have for questions this afternoon. Thank you very much to Dr. Denise Ferreira da Silva for this insightful presentation and discussion on shift in thinking. It all begins with decolonization. It has been such a pleasure to join you for today's Big Thinking lecture. Thank you. On behalf of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, thank you to the Big Thinking series sponsors, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Universities Canada, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation. If you would like to revisit today's presentation and this conversation, the video will be available on the Congress 2022 platform in the coming days. Today's Big Thinking Lecture is the third of 4 events at Congress 2022. We hope you will join us for the 4th and final lecture on May 19th from 12 o'clock to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Petrocultures, Reflections on 10 Years of Research and Advocacy for a World in Crisis, with Dr. Emir Sisman, and Dr. Sheena Wilson. This lecture will take place in English. Until then, you can keep participating in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags, hashtag Big Thinking and Congress, and that's Congress with an H at the end. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you're enjoying Congress 2022 and that we will see you at another Big Thinking lecture soon.